pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth.
President's bullet-ridden body in the street. Ride, Johnny, ride. Kennedy's shattered head hits concrete. Ride, Johnny, ride. Johnny's wife is floundering. Johnny's wife is scared. Run, Jackie, run. Texas is an outrage when your husband is dead. Texas is an outrage when they pick up his head. Texas is the reason that the president's dead. You gotta suck, Jackie, suck. Misfits, Bullet. Do you know those lyrics? Probably you've heard that song a million times. Well, if you haven't, you should have. It's the Misfits. I mean, goddamn, if there isn't a more essential band of the last 30, 40 years, or is it even 50 years? Must be, almost, whatever it is. Misfits, Bullet. The reason I bring up those lyrics is because today's podcast, number 148 of Agitators Anonymous, is about conspiracy theories. It's about, at least in my own sort of small, dumb kind of way, I'm going to take 10 things that we should apply, and like a mental checklist when we hear the phrase conspiracy theory. And what is widely acknowledged as the greatest conspiracy theory of them all? Well, there's two, I guess. There's the moon landing. Who killed John F. Kennedy? I mean, that's a conspiracy, isn't it? And there are theories about who killed him, and they are what was once called conspiracy theories. All right, so the podcast is sponsored by metalblade.com. Go to indie merch, INDIE merch.com/metalblade. The link will be below in the description, and you can use the promo code AA2023 for 10% off. I'll repeat all of that in a while. So you can follow me on Instagram, _Primordial or Primordial_official. There's going to be quite a few interesting and cool things happening over there soon enough, actually. If you want to follow Primordial, because we're going to start recording a new album soon, so there'll be a couple of little video parts. There's going to be a bit of this, a bit of that happening over there. Might be interesting, might not be interesting. We'll wait and see. Anyway, album number 9, is it? I think it might be 9. Who knows? Who can tell? And if you've been listening to the podcast the last while, you'll know that I posted a new song by a band called Verminous Serpent I've been taking part in. Well, today, the vinyls and the CD arrived, and so we will have some to sell on March the 17th, so keep watching out for that. Yes, I know, March the 17th, we didn't pick that. Anyway, so why am I going to talk about conspiracy theories, and could it get me into trouble? Possibly, and probably not. I don't know, who knows. However, there's a podcast that I really like. It's called Unheard. Now, you see what they've done there. Unheard, H-E-R-D, as in don't be part of the herd, and don't be unheard. It's a quite kind of pun on the word unheard. But anyway, they have this guy called Freddie Sayers, who's sort of like, I think, an avatar of a what a middle-aged woman would create for herself as a Mills and Boon type swashbuckling hero with his super posh accent and rugged, handsome good looks. Anyway, Freddie hosts Unheard podcast and YouTube and whatever it is, and they were discussing with a woman called Fiona Hill, who I must admit I did not know. They were discussing with her. He's very even-handed and level and very, very, very calm. The show is good. Anyway, enough promo for them, as if they need it. But Fiona Hill, this woman, was discussing the Nord Stream pipeline explosion. She has been, she sat at the table with Putin. She has been in the corridors of power and seemed to have some valuable insight. Now, if you go and listen to the episode with her, you can decide whether or not that's true. That's not really what I'm talking about here. But she had an opinion about the Nord Stream pipeline. And she said initially she thought it was the Russians. Then she changed her mind. Then she thought, well, maybe it is the Americans. And then kind of, propositioned the fact that, who knows, perhaps the Ukrainians did it. Either way, that is what you would call traditionally, she was theorizing about a conspiracy. And that's what a conspiracy theory fundamentally is, or at least it should be, before those two words became very weaponized. It should be your right to theorize about what something is a conspiracy or not. But she was going through the motions, the cogs were whirring, the grey matter was beginning to fire up, her neurons were going, and she was laying out some different claims. Now, of course, when it comes to the Nord Stream pipeline, and I'll use it as an example later on, Biden did say, if he laid it out clearly, you can go and find the soundbite, if Russia invades Ukraine, then the Nord Stream pipeline is over, quote unquote. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to to examine the concept of a conspiracy theory. What makes a conspiracy theory, and the modern politics around the word. There are two words that we hear constantly these days. I hear it several times a week. I hear it sometimes in relation to my own good self, to people discussing me online, generally and almost always without validity or without ever asking me about it. It's just a kind of throwaway comment, but it's quite a weighty, serious thing to level against somebody. There are two words that we hear constantly in 2023, and we have done for about 4 or 5 or 6 years. But I feel too many people use the term without really thinking about it. It's used most of the time to dismiss someone, to dismiss whatever it is they're saying, without really thinking about it, without investigating the claim. It's just a kind of a put down. It's become a slur. If you say to somebody, you're just a conspiracy theorist, that means really, I don't really want to discuss this or talk about it, and I also don't really want to spend the time to investigate the claims. And lately, the claim has been that a conspiracy theory is only something that the far right would be occupied with, which, as you probably noticed, it feels like kind of any protest against the state, government, tech, pharma, whoever you want to say, is put down very often as far right, or the opinions that they, the opinions that they espouse are claimed to be conspiracy theory. But is that exactly fair? Because once upon a time, being on the left meant you questioned power and authority, and the right was far more pro-military and pro-state and backed the power of its institutions. The left traditionally held them to account, or wished devolution from those institutions of power, or the inheritance of power. Obviously, you go back to the difference between a republic and a monarchy, all those kind of things. But it feels like something has changed over the last decade or so. And why is that? What has changed? Well, we've discussed it before on the podcast, but I think that the derangement of social media is obviously part of it. But increasingly, let's call them the new left, because as I've said many times, I sort of represent the politically homeless as far as I consider it, and would consider myself old left, as in the concerns of the old left: healthcare, housing, education, all those kind of things. The derangement of social media has increasingly left the new left in a place that they seem to embrace draconian ideals as it pursues justice over, for example, liberty. Maybe the analogy of the political horseshoe makes sense. Eventually, the furthest reaches of both sides almost meet as they bend around. Think of the shape of a horseshoe, and that's the sort of horseshoe politics analogy. Yet, once upon a time, questioning the profit motives of pharma, supporting the deep state military-industrial complex, and the implementation of new draconian rules. I like the word draconian. It's pretty cool. I don't like the band called Draconian, but I do like the word draconian. Anyway, they've kind of ruined that word for me. Anyway, draconian rules and laws, questioning them is what sort of the left stood for. And sadly, as someone who identifies with these old liberal principles and ideals, I see more and more people calling for censorship. And it would seem blindly backing power and authority. I don't think this ends well. Of course, elements of the right, they do this as well. But let's not, sort of get bogged down in the binary choices we so often seem to be asked to choose between in modern society. The truth is always and always the mantra of our Agitators Anonymous. The truth is in the grey area. But what is clear is that to call someone a conspiracy theorist now, it ranks pretty highly on the Orwellian checklist of sort of right think. It's used and weaponized as something to put somebody down, to put them in their place. And as words like disinformation, misinformation, as these words are used more and more by authority. And we read lots of times about new incoming hate speech bills, which are going to try and cover hate, misinformation and disinformation. What exactly mis and disinformation are, of course, is kind of vague, and that's sort of the point, because then you can implement it at will across many, many different platforms or different social, cultural, geopolitical angles. You can cover all sorts of angles. Now, of course, there are conspiracy theories that are, we could say, are damaging for society, all that kind of thing. But again, the implementation of any form of censorship is such a vague tool in the hands of the modern technocratic state. If every problem looks like a nail and you're wielding a hammer, you're going to hammer it, right? Regardless of the context. At least that's how somebody who is worried about freedom of speech thinks. And it's kind of the skeptical and I would say rational way of viewing these things, considering the way society is moving and going. But what is a conspiracy theory in reality? But I suppose a point of view over a subject. Yet I think we're going to see a real crackdown on who has views, who has the ability to put those views out into the mainstream, and especially a move by the old traditional mainstream media and seats of power to remove the ability of these kind of new up-and-coming YouTubers and social media and commentators to have an even playing field in front of them, to be able to disseminate their own views of certain events in the public sphere. It was only, at the beginning of lockdown, we were told that several points of view or misinformation, disinformation should be censored, should be taken out of the public discourse, and that you could be kind of unpersoned from all your platforms for discussing them. And yet now they are sort of accepted as common. They're sort of accepted and agreed on as the process of events that actually really happened. So the point I always return to is who is making the decisions. If we take two concepts like liberty and safety, they're very simple concepts, and I understand the need for both. But at the same time, who defines the parameters of what safety is or what liberty is? There's so many subcontexts and subcontextual layers to all of these words that it makes the process of nuance, which, let's be honest, everything is nuanced. It makes the process of nuance and context something that, by and large, the main narrative just doesn't want to go into, because they want to give you a binary choice, good or evil, yes or no. And the grey area where everything resides, it's just too much to think about, too much to process, too much ballast, too much weighing down the narrative. We've got to release the ballast and let it float to the surface. What am I talking about? Well, I've had well-meaning and clever friends of mine dismiss something as conspiracy theory without ever really thinking about it. You've heard me discuss, for example, the World Economic Forum on the podcast before. Now, how much influence they have in the real world is, it's open to question. Is it just a talk shop for millionaires? I mean, it is that. But their existence and their aims are clearly defined on their own website and through their own content. And so it is most definitely not a conspiracy. But people who haven't bothered to look at either of those things will just say it. They'll just repeat the mantra. So why do so many people resort to casting something off so quickly? I would say it's part propaganda, mainstream media narrative that creates this almost Pavlovian response within people, a knee-jerk reaction to hearing something that you've been told is outlandish, or the people of the other, the othering of society, that they think that. You surely don't want to side with them, right? To be on the wrong side of the fence that we've artificially created to, ring fence this argument. So people want to be not only in the in group, but also to virtue signal. But more often than not, it's not necessarily even that at all. Those are the sort of kind of created media talking points about it. But what I often find among people is they have busy, complex lives with pressure and stress, whether it's kids or school or whatever else, and they haven't the time to ponder over the implications of Klaus Schwab and the concept of you will own nothing and you will be happy. they just can't process all of that. They've got work, they've got things to do. They're busy, they're nuanced, complicated people. And that's never really a story that's told by either side of this binary choice in the argument as they scream at each other over the barricades. Is that most people are in the middle and they're just, the noise is deafening around some subjects and they just want to be told, like, what is this? So that I don't have to do the thinking. The problem is, of course, who's telling you what to think or what not to think about. The concept, as like I said, if you will own nothing and you will be happy, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's written on a website. It's one of their mission statements. And they also, I suppose an awful lot of people don't like the likes of me or the likes of you pulling back the metaphorical curtain and saying to them, hey, it could be that you are lied to now and again by the institutions that you ask to keep you and your children and your family safe. So they push back. They push back because I'm a pain in the arse. They push back. It's natural. I get it. So yesterday, a friend sent me a story about the 15-minute city living protests in the UK. And you know, this is the same guy who 6 or 9 months ago was saying the World Economic Forum was a conspiracy theory as we had a beer together. I said, well, okay, but you should do a little bit more research about whether you think it is or not. I mean, some of it is patently nonsense, just a billionaire boys club. But there's so many powerful people there. There's got to be more substance to it. Again, the truth is kind of both things at the same time. But I said to him, 15-minute living cities. You can, if you want to search it, put in 15-minute living Oxfordshire in the UK. And I said to him, well, you do know that this 15-minute living ideal, although it's been around for decades, it's kind of one of their policies or one of the things that they discuss in action. But come on, brain. But in this instance, it affected his sister living abroad directly. And all of a sudden it was relevant. And isn't that the same for an awful lot of people? Yet aren't we all a bit like that? Things are a conspiracy theory until they aren't. Until they bump up against you in your life. But maybe then is it too late? I don't know. It's hard to say. As always on Agitators Anonymous, the mantra is the truth is grey. I'm politically homeless and we try and hold the middle ground. Skepticism is the only rational perspective, especially when dealing with such institutions of great power, authority and wealth. Always in the grey area. There are a multitude of different reasons, vectors, moving at different angles, rational and irrational actors, states, power and influence over any one situation, and of course, chaos. Everything is chaotic. There is a bureaucratic wildness to proceedings that we just always can't quantify. Chaos theory, the binary choice just isn't always logical. And neither, though, is dismissing things you've not really thought about as conspiracy theory simply because the others think about it. The othering of those we're supposed to be against, or talk about it, or have thought about it, or have seen it on one of their, heard about it, or seen about it on a clip of somebody saying, look what they're thinking about over there. Politics is about consensus. But part of the problem in the modern age is that too many people have become binary and partisan in their view of things. We could say almost religious, orthodox even. So therefore, giving any ground to someone you're supposed to be opposed to is like admitting defeat. And as a modern society, I think it's terrible. It's a terrible shame we do this, but we prize doubling down. It's now become a virtue. And it's hardly surprising we're in the mess that we're in. Or are we really in a mess? Or maybe it's just my algorithm playing me. And I look out the window and things aren't that bad. Again, middle ground truth. Of course, there are conspiracy theories that are damaging, that have some rather evil implications. It's not difficult to think about which ones. Let's, in a historical context, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, for example. And I'm going to throw a few examples here and there into what I'm going to talk about now for the rest of the podcast to illustrate the point. But does that mean we should censor them? Complicated. You know me, I'm never on the side of censorship, as I think, down that path leads authoritarianism. The best antidote to bad speech is good speech, or the best antidote to conspiracy is hauling it out into the light to have a look at it, to examine it, to question it. Otherwise, you just make martyrs of it and drive the conversation underground. And while you think for a moment, it's nice to sit down and think, I won that confrontation. Doesn't really work like that. Eventually, the censors come for all sides of the debate. But that's not really my point here. I'm never on the side, as I said, of censorship. Sure, things can be difficult or uncomfortable to deal with and consider, but it really is about who does the censoring, I suppose. Who decides what is and isn't a valid theory? Because that's what a conspiracy theory is. It's a theory. Who killed JFK? Well, some people say it's the mafia. Some people say it's, the CIA. These are theories, right? If you've watched Oliver Stone, as maddening and crazy as he seems on Joe Rogan, he will have dragged you through about 20 or 30 conspiracy theories in the process of just one episode. Sometimes it can be staggering to try and just sort of get a foothold on where his mind is. But he just rails through them super hard. But who decides whether he's right or wrong? It's surely better to think about the implications of the things that he says. This is more what would concern me than the availability of a potentially divisive theory. But it got me thinking about conspiracy theories, how we should think about them. So in my head, I've made up a rough 10-point checklist, and here on episode 148, you can humor me by having a listen to my 10 points and see if you agree. Maybe they make some sense, maybe they don't make some sense. Have a little think and let me know. Hey, Alan, that's fucking bullshit. Or, yeah, you maybe have a point. All right, so the first thing is motive. If you think about your average conspiracy theory, the first thing, I think the really the intellectual way to do it, and it seems like such a simple word, but what is the motive for doing something? Let's take the Nord Stream, the gas pipeline, and look at the people who may have blown it up. We've already seen, if you maybe have done some investigating, that Biden basically said, yeah, we are going to blow this pipeline up. What is their motive? I suppose it's to remove European dependence on Russian gas and to step into that breach themselves. Initially, everyone said it was Russian because it had some sort of hallmarks of, Russian espionage or secretive industrial operations, the kind of which you saw in the annexation of several countries over the last 10 or 15 years. But the motive, what was the motive? Think about all the other things you have as conspiracy theories. People say the moon landing conspiracy theory. What was the motive for faking that? How could that have worked out? And so in thinking about the motive, this is really when you're boiling down to why would someone do that? And if you can't really find a logical reason for that, then the chances are there probably isn't one. And these are the smoke and mirrors, the noise that is surrounding a theory. People talk about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which seemed to be the precursor to the United States, becoming more engaged in the Vietnam War. If you consider JFK, who had the motives for killing him? So that's, I think, the first thing to consider. Then what we must consider, number two, is the means. Is it possible? This woman, Fiona Hill, on Unheard, says, well, the Ukrainians could have done it, could have blown up this pipeline. And then she kind of muses and wonders, well, do they have the means? As in, can they get people into that position to be undetected, to plant explosive, whatever it is? Is it possible? Do they have the means? Does a small country with maybe a much smaller military or all of that kind of stuff, do they have the means to infiltrate a greater country? Do they have the means to be able to go undetected, to fly in undetected, or suppose these days to hack into surveillance systems? So when you're thinking about pick a country in the world and then pick a conspiracy theory that's related to them. It's normal after a huge attack happens in Europe that many different groups will claim responsibility for it, all in a way trying to claim the infamy, trying to claim almost advertising themselves as more powerful than they are. But did they have the means to actually do that? To plant such a bomb of such a size, to be able to mobilize people and drop them behind enemy lines. So that's an important thing to consider along with motive when considering who you're actually talking about. And this is the same thing. I'm not only necessarily talking about violence or political espionage. It could be, there are conspiracy theories about FIFA, about sports, about all sorts of things, about, match fixing, all that kind of thing. Like if you, only the other day, there was some match fixing allegations against referees. What do they stand to gain by that? Barcelona, I think, had been paying off. They had some guy who was the head of the referee commission, Barcelona, the football team, for 20 years, and the guy had received €7 million. Now, they say it was for consultation, all sorts of things. But what are the theories around what this referee was getting from Barcelona? Are we saying there's match fixing? Are we saying there's this? Are we saying there's that? What's the motive? What are the means? And I think you can apply this to everything from geopolitics all the way down to, conspiracies of who did this or that between neighbours. Opportunity. I think that's the third one. Could it be carried out? It's one thing having the motive, and it's another thing having the means. Let's say you do have both of those things, but do you have the opportunity? There are some countries that are like impregnable fortresses. If you had the motive, for example, to let's say, take North Korea. The rest of the world has a motive to, or would have had a motive to halt them from gaining nuclear weapons. And by now it's too late. Or let's say you have the motive and the means to stop Iran from developing nuclear capability. But do you have the opportunity to stop it? Depending on you, who that is. But the opportunity, are you able to enact the plan? Fourth, historical precedent. Now, this is kind of important, and I think this is very interesting. The historical precedent of empires, of huge nations basically bullying small nations, telling them what's what. Whether it's, the United States intervention in Central America, whether it's, deposing, Mossadegh in Iran in 1952, I think, or, CIA coups, throughout Central and South America, imposing dictators, all these kind of stuff. You look at all these people, like, say, Gaddafi's relationship to the West, where he was in, he was out. All of these kind of things. Yeah, my good example is the Lockerbie bombing, which Gaddafi claimed for Libya, the Libyan, freedom resistance movement, whatever you want to call it. Consider motive, means, and opportunity for that. And yes, it was a baggage handler, I think, who worked through Malta, who placed a bomb on board a plane. So you have motive, means, and opportunity. The opportunity before this is 1986, I think, before the security got too so well enforced or whatever. So historical precedent. Has X country a history of doing, or X company or secret service organization, or whatever you want to say, do they have a history, a historical precedent? If a bomb went off in Ireland, and there's been a couple of instances since we've had a ceasefire with the IRA and with the English state, whatever you want to say, every now and again something does still happen, and you have to say to yourself, is there historical precedent? Well, yes, because people who planted bombs and who did kill people, they haven't quite gone away, as they say. So there is people there with the physical historical precedent. So does a huge country have the precedent of doing these kind of things, of intervening in other countries' affairs? If yes, then you have historical precedent, political precedent. That's the fifth thing. So let's take, for example, countries that have, let's say, left-wing revolutionary movements, maybe in Colombia or something, the FARC, or in Peru, or in North South America, whatever you want to say. Sorry, the north of South America. There are any country which has revolutionary, counter-revolutionary movements which are attempting to overthrow, despotism or authoritarianism. You could call that the political precedent exists for those people to try and commit acts that one would theorize about their motivations. So something has to have a political precedent. And maybe, it's not hard to think of what that would be. In Ireland, there is a political precedent and a historical precedent for resistance movements. Now, sixth, I would say, is it logical? Is it rational? Just because something seems to fit and it's a kind of sexy answer, is it logical? Is it rational? Now, for people, I know the moon landing. I've never really been that interested in the whole moon landing stuff. But the theory is, of course, that they faked the moon landing and all that kind of thing. What would be the logical or rational, purposes of that? And could you keep the thousands of people, in on producing such an occurrence quiet? So when you think about some of the famous conspiracy theories, think how many people must be involved, like even 9/11 or that kind of thing. How many people theoretically must be involved in a massive conspiracy? And how do you keep thousands of people or hundreds of people that surely will, it's human nature, tell their nearest and dearest and so on and so on? How do you keep that quiet over decades and decades and decades? What's the logical, rational analysis of what's just happened? And that's sort of connected to my seventh point, which is the risk of comeback or guilt. Now, of course, one man or one woman acting alone. I often use the example of, Gabriela Princip, shooting the Archduke Ferdinand dead on the streets of Sarajevo. That's one person acting essentially, he had an accomplices on that day and he was part of what I think is this Black Hand organization, Serbian nationalist organization. But at the same time, he acted fundamentally alone that day. And the risk of comeback guilt for somebody who's just acting alone, I'm not sure that they necessarily think about all those things. Surely it didn't cross his mind, this is going to start a world war. But if you're in a state, as in a nation state, and you think, well, if we attack, say, if we have our revolutionary or our counterinsurgency movement attack another country, and then we're going to risk them carpet bombing our cities, this again ties into the logical, rational view of things. Are you going to use, let's say, a 10% force and get 50% force back and risk not only being killed yourself, but your entire town and cities being leveled? Or, for example, in the case of sanctions, even wars have been declared over things, the actions of a tiny few people. I think there is a logical, rational view to some of these things. Now, of course, if you're being, terribly oppressed as a state, sometimes people become absolutely desperate, but that's also part of the logical, rational way of viewing the precedents or viewing the particular theory. Think to yourself, the person who committed this act, what did they rationally or logically perhaps think would be the comeback, the blowback? I mean, do the Japanese think, if we bomb Pearl Harbor, maybe are we going to get bombed with a nuclear bomb? In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and kill X amount of people? You have to think of the kind of chain of events there, that if they knew what might have happened, would that have stopped them? Again, complicated. But I think it's tied into analysing, as I said, the logical or the rationality of the occurrence. 8, I have the power of propaganda. Which I suppose is really relevant to our modern mainstream narrative. Does the propaganda back up the theory? Or, for example, are you being fed propaganda which is trying to push you into one way or another to accept, repercussions down the line? Could it be that the power of propaganda is what is compelling elements of society to move towards viewing the narrative one way or the other? I mean, think about JFK was, shot openly in public, and they never really, they blamed it on Lee Harvey Oswald. Could have been, might not have been. Did he have links to Russia? Could have done, might have done. It's complicated, and no one really seems quite to know. But you can be sure that there was a huge amount of propaganda trying to sway public opinion, both ways or the other. Take the Nazis in World War, leading up to World War II. At one stage, they portrayed Stalin and the Bolsheviks as, satanic, as their ultimate opponents. But yet, in 1938, I think early 1939, you have the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and all of a sudden they start changing the propaganda and changing society's view, moulding it. in a completely different view of the Soviets from where they were previously. So the power of propaganda is also a thing to consider. Controlling the narrative is my number 9. And that is, it's linked to the propaganda angle, but who controls the narrative of the truth that you're consuming? Think back to the invasion of Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. They were linked inexorably. We heard them all the time in the news. If you're not old enough, this is what happened. It was just weapons of mass destruction, the sexed up dossier that led Blair into the war, all that kind of stuff. And they found there was no weapons of mass destruction, but yet it was a constant control of this propagandizing and this narrative to maneuver people into accepting that they they had no choice but to enter the war. Similar, I suppose, to what's happening now in Ukraine. There's a binary choice where you support or you don't support good or evil. But in reality, many people are dying and there doesn't seem to be much diplomacy. So who's controlling the narrative about pouring weapons into Ukraine? So that's what I would say is number 9. Number 10, the final one, and that's geography. The location. And this was maybe a bit more relevant 20, 30, 40 years ago before we could drone strike people and all that kind of stuff. But if you take Russia, was invaded by Napoleon and was invaded by the Nazis, and they all failed on the frozen Russian steppe because Russia's geography, this huge frozen tundra of a steppe before you get to Moscow and stuff, and freezing temperatures of minus 15, 20, 25, 30 degrees, soldiers sent out without being properly clothed, fed, trained. The Russians who kind of had their asses handed to them during the Winter War with the Finns, because of, well, there's many reasons why, but the Finns had skiing, units on skis and much more maneuverability, all this kind of stuff. Just off the top of my head, I'm just plucking things out. Geography and location. Ireland is an island. But during World War II, Churchill was very worried that the Nazis would invade England through Ireland. There's geographical reasons why Dunkirk was picked. So geography and location has got something really important to it. Take the countries of... Well, take any country that is divided by a huge mountain range and think to yourself, say Afghanistan, how many foreign armies failed in Afghanistan because of the terrain, that they just couldn't succeed. How many countries are defended maybe by, a sea on one side and a massive mountain range on the other? And then think to yourself, could that conspiracy theory have really happened in that country? Because it seems unlikely if you check back through all of the other 10 things that they were, I'll say them out now, but it's, like I said, motive and means. Was it possible? The opportunity, could it be carried out? And then you could say geography and locational, and also other things like seasonal, all those kind of stuff, all practical reasons as to why a country may or may not be attacked, or even a company, I suppose. Or anything really, historical precedent, political precedent. Is it logical? Is it rational? What would be the reasons why agencies of power or influence or a rational or irrational actor would do this? Of course, if an actor is irrational on the world stage, well, then it's completely unpredictable. And some of these things, I guess, don't necessarily make sense. But even still, I think you can apply them to the logic of somebody who isn't maybe even thinking about the next few things, which are the risk of comeback, guilt, sanctions, even war, the power of the propaganda that drives the narrative and who controls that narrative. That is kind of how I think about, or try and think about, conspiracy theories when I have a moment in the space and somebody says to me, oh, isn't that a conspiracy theory? And then you think to yourself, okay, well, does it make sense? Or do we just jump to the sexiest answer, the most binary sort of, it's good and evil sort of answer? Hanlon's razor. Hanlon's razor is something I think about often, and that is never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. And I think that there's a great worth in considering Hanlon's razor when you think about things. And this, I think, is especially when dealing with the catastrophization of sometimes things by the right. For example, even pandemic and lockdown and stuff, the catastrophization of it in terms of loss of liberty, which I understand completely, but yet at the same time, the idea that all of these things are top-down and pyramidical structures, where only a tiny room full of, some sort of shadowy cabal is running the world. It cannot be true because the world is far too complicated and bureaucratic. Of course, there are influential people with some very nefarious motives. There's no denying that. And sometimes these things do come true, but sometimes they also come true by accident, or, as in the case of Hanlon's razor, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Now, of course, I think maybe Hanlon's razor is a tiny bit outdated in terms of the modern technocratic state, but I think it's still worth thinking about. And then I would say, even despite the fact that I've just laid out 10 points for a checklist, that is Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is very interesting. I guess it's the law of parsimony, a philosophical tool for shaving off unlikely explanations. So let's say it's basically saying that when you are faced with many, many explanations for a situation, it's generally, I suppose a statistical rule, that the simplest explanation will probably be the one. And this kind of ties into the ideas of motive, means, opportunity, etc., all those kind of things. The simplest answer is often the correct one. So if we consider a conspiracy theory and somebody says, well, it's all of these EU member states are conspiring to this, that, and the other, and then you think, well, okay, well, how many people would that involve? And that would involve top-down bureaucracy in every country working in tandem, all marching to the beat of the same drum with the same political motives and objectives, and you realize that can't be true. It's just too complicated. There's too many moving parts. So to try and look for the simplest motive and the simplest direction, that's, I think, what Occam's razor says. And I think to top all of that off, like the cherry on the top, to try and divorce oneself from having an emotional reaction to these things. So not be emotional about viewing what is a conspiracy theory, or to be led by the propaganda to assume that something is or isn't. But to sort of, I suppose, dispassionately examine the logical or rational reasons why something may or may not happen, and the idea that there is there a conspiracy around it? Well, my friends, I don't know. That's kind of how I'm trying to view some of these things, and I think, well, maybe some of that was helpful, or maybe some of that is worth applying to the odd thing that's happening. Whether you want to take the war in Ukraine or whatever else, and consider what are the motives. Anyway. Maybe I'm talking too much around the same subject, and I should just get back in my box and talk about heavy metal some more. Yeah, you're probably right. Anyway, conspiracy theories. Agitators Anonymous, episode 148, my friends. We shall see you next Tuesday for the heavy metal ramble miscellany, and I got some interviews coming up and some more stuff about music on the way and incoming. I'm Alan Averill, your hostess with the leastest, over and out.